there are a whole host of minerals that make up a soil. And how balanced those minerals are defines how well microbes can survive. You have things like copper, magnesium, calcium, potassium. Soil is just a big blend of all these different minerals. How imbalanced one soil is versus another depends on a lot of different things, but no soil is perfect. And so the soils that we're going to be growing in inevitably are going to be imbalanced in some way or another. And that's the case for your place as well. So we really, in order to see what's going on in our soil, we need to have some sort of visual representation, some numbers that we can look at in order to correct this imbalance. But to get those numbers, we have to take a soil test first. And a soil test really is just a representation, an even representation of your growing space mixed up in a little sample that you send off to a laboratory that's going to do a whole host of different things to it to determine what kind of minerals make up your soil and what percentages. So to take a soil test, think about your garden space from a bird's eye view. You're looking down on it, and you really want to pick 5 to 10 spots around your garden, evenly distributed. You want to take a good representative sample of the space that you'll be growing in. And you want to dig with a good old-fashioned shovel about 6 to 8 inches down. That's really going to be where the roots are going to live. So once you do that, I've already done that with a few different spots behind me, and I've put that sample in my bucket. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to dig a little bit, and as you can see, what I've got from here down is really where my root zone is. And so I'm going to take this soil from here down, and I'm going to get in my bucket, and the stuff that was on the top I'm going to try to scrape off. Not that we don't want to test this soil on the top, but this isn't really what we're concerned about. We're more concerned about the lower layers. Now, once we have enough samples, 5 to 10 samples, a soil lab really wants you to send them about 2 cups of soil. And I've got a glove around here because you don't really want to touch it with your bare hands if you can help it. Your hands can have different salts on it or different materials on it. Unless your hand is really clean, it's best not to touch your soil. So you also want a really clean bucket as well. So you're going to take your soil and you're just going to mix it up really well. Just get all the different layers mixed up. And this is really one of the keys about getting a representative sample, which just means an average sample of your growing space. You're going to want to pick out any stems or debris and take about 2 cups, which is 2 large handfuls, depending on how big your hand is. It can be a little more than 2 cups. Put it in your bag, air out of it, zip it up. And these bags tend to fit really well in the post office, the USPS flat rate box, the small flat rate box. They fit really well in there. So you just take your sample, you put it in your flat rate box, send it to your lab, but you got to call them first. A lot of times the labs really want you to communicate first with you. They'll let you know what their protocol is, what you need to send them, how much money you need to send them to do the test, and you get all those details figured out. But to take a sample, remember, you got to pick 5 to 10 even spots, mix it up in your bucket, make sure you're getting it about 6 to 8 inches, 4 to 8 inches down, mix it up, put it in a bag, and send it off. It's pretty simple. And once you do send it off, and they do analyze it, they'll come back with a lot of numbers and a recommendation. Once we get these results back, we'll be able to see what exactly is in our soil, what imbalances there are, and how do we correct those. Now you've seen how we take a soil sample from the soil that we have natively and not raised bed soil. But if you do have raised bed soil and it's already been there for a while, or you've just established it, you've just imported some new raised bed soil or made your own raised bed soil, I do recommend you test that as well, because after all, we don't want to be flying blind whether or not we're growing in regular old soil that's right there in your yard, or if we have raised bed soil that we've imported or made our own. So either way, you really need to get it tested. Don't skip this step. All right, so once you've gotten your soil test results back, it's going to look something like this. So as you can see here, this is what your soil report will look like. It may look a little bit different than this if you don't use Kinsey Agricultural Services, but in general, they're going to give you about the same information. So There's a lot of writing here, and we're going to take it step by step and see what we can find. So you can see it's got the location and the crop that we're growing, and it's important to indicate to them, or to most labs, that you're going to be growing just a mix of vegetables, because these labs tend to have very specific types of recommendations. If you're going to grow a certain kind of crop like blueberries, for instance, or commodity crops like grains, they're going to give you a different recommendation than if you're growing just mixed garden vegetables, because this is a general purpose balancing of minerals. You have the field sample location. For me, it's the family garden, the lab it came from. The total exchange capacity is a measure of conductivity in the soil, basically how many electrically charged ions are available in this soil. Exchange capacity is usually higher with a clay particles, with a heavy clay particle soil, because you have a lot more ions in there because there's a lot more particles present. You have a desired calcium and magnesium ratio. One thing that I really want to highlight first is the pH. So pH is a measure of acidity. And what that's showing us is that our soil sample has got a pH of 6.8. 7 is a neutral soil. So this is a slightly acid soil. The lower the number, the more acid. The higher the number, the more basic. Growing vegetables, you really want to have slightly acidic soil. So 6.8 is actually a really great number for us. If you are growing in a spot that you're trying to grow things like blueberries or more acid-loving plants, you do want to see a lower pH than that. But for us, and for most garden vegetables, 6.8 is a great number. This is the humus content that I talked about before. Humus is also another word for organic matter or loam. We're at 2.33%. So like I said before, the best, a great range for organic matter or humus content is 3 to 8%. And so we're a little low on that. So we know, we already knew that, but we can see that in a number right here. So we know that we're going to be needing to add a good amount of organic matter and to build that percentage up. Then we have our base saturation percent, and this is really just, it just means that these numbers represent a certain percentage of these minerals present in our soil. So they use these numbers in the consulting firms and the labs to build recommendations. So we're going to go down and look at the different, they call them anions and cations. That refers to the type of charge, positive or negative. But for our purposes, we can just look at this as nitrogen, sulfate, phosphates, calcium, magnesium, potassium, sodium. And then we have some minor trace minerals down here. So starting with nitrogen, you can see that we don't have anything there. And that's because a lot of these labs and consulting services, they're going to assume that you have your own nitrogen protocol, which basically just means that you are going to add a certain kind of fertilizer, that you don't need them to tell you how much nitrogen to add. And that's really the case as well. And what I'll do is when we get to that point in our lessons, we'll be talking about how much nitrogen to use and where it comes from and why we only apply nitrogen at certain times of the year and not at the beginning of the season. Mainly it's because nitrogen leaves the soil very quickly and it's taken up by the plants in abundance. So we need to be careful when adding nitrogen. Sulfates is the number of 9 parts per million, and they're recommending just a little bit of an elemental sulfur, which is a 90 to 92% sulfur. And just bear with me until the end. We'll talk about what these substances are. Looking down here at calcium, it's giving us a desired value and a value found. And so it's showing us we have a little bit of a surplus in calcium, a little bit of a deficit in magnesium, also in potassium, and it's recommending these different substances here, these different materials, dolomite, sulfamag or K-mag, potassium sulfate, sodium, we're a little excessive, so we don't need anything there. And then these trace minerals. And these trace minerals are really kind of something that's in for the long term. These things break down very slowly, and they really want you to have these minerals in balance over the long haul. And so they're not quite, and that's why they have just, you can see This is recommended in pounds per 1,000 square feet, and that's going to give you, 15 ounces of borax, which you read that right. It's borax like you put in your laundry. That contains boron, so it's just 15 ounces of that per 1,000 square feet. 7.25 ounces of some zinc sulfate. So these are just real small amounts. Now, what we're seeing here is we've sent in a soil sample, they've analyzed it, what's in it, and they're telling us over here what to put in it. What is it deficient in, or what does it have a surplus of? And so this you can think of as kind of a recipe. So this is, or a prescription, if you will. So what we would do is we would go and find these minerals and add them in these quantities per 1,000 square feet. So if you've got 3,000 square feet of a garden, you're going to be adding 3 times what they recommend. If you've only got 100 square feet, you're only going to be doing 1/10 of what they recommend. So what you see here also is this is a recommendation from a consulting service. So this isn't necessarily just a soil test. A soil test will give you these values over here, but it will not necessarily give you the recommendations. And that's why I really believe that it's important to go with a soil lab or a consulting service that works with a lab, where you can call in, you can send them your sample, they'll analyze your soil, and they'll also give you recommendations with it. Calculating these numbers is not for the faint of heart. It's pretty complex because some of these things add minerals and materials that the other ones are calling for, and so if you do one and not the other, you can easily get overabundance in some of these materials. So another thing that I'll just note about the bottom here, it says, best not to use waste compost here due to high calcium levels in both the soil and the compost. And what they're assuming is that our compost is made with food waste, which also contains eggshells, which is very high in calcium, which will raise the pH of the soil. And since our calcium is already in a little bit of a surplus, you don't want to add eggshells to your soil, because that's just going to increase your calcium level and then increase your pH as well. So they even give you these notes, which are really helpful. But that also means that if your compost, if you know that it doesn't have calcium, like eggshells in it, then you don't necessarily need to pay attention to this. And then it also says, note to high calcium level, best not to incorporate compost currently on top of the soil. And this was a note that I sent them. I said, we do have some compost that we have on top of the soil. Should I work that in? And they remember, they took a note of that, and they gave me a recommendation based on that. So, so this is what our recommendation looks like. And so now we're going to look at what these materials are. How do we get them? So these materials are, they come in the form of sulfates, and right here, they just look like little beads that you have in your little aroma pillows. They're a really interesting little hemisphere pelletized element. And so this is a zinc sulfate, an iron sulfate, a magnesium sulfate. This is our elemental sulfur. This is 90% sulfur. This is a salt that's high in potassium. This is regular old Epsom salt, which is good for magnesium. And then we have some lime over here. And so garden centers do not carry these types of materials. Most of the time, if you go to a garden center, they're going to have lime, or they might have some potassium or some fertilizers. But these kind of minerals that we're talking about, they're only going to be found in farming supply warehouses. There's one that I really love. It's called Seven Springs Farm. It's in Virginia, and they have a great website. We have a link to that in the notes, and you can browse all their products. And when Kinsey, if you use Kinsey Ag Services and you look at all the materials that they recommend, you'll be able to find all of those materials at Seven Springs Farm. You can buy from a 2-pound bag to a 50-pound bag of whatever it is, and they'll ship it right to your door. So once you get your materials, you'll calculate how many square feet you have, do your multiplication or division, and come up with a recipe. Once you have your recipe, you just start weighing out your materials. Let's say it says 1/2 pound of sulfur per 1,000 square feet. If I'm working on 1,000 square feet, I'm going to use 1/2 pound of this sulfur. I'm going to add it to a bucket. Same thing, go down the list. If you need some zinc, you do 5 ounces of zinc, add it to the bucket. If you need some potassium or some magnesium, same thing. Weigh a little bit out, add it to the bucket. You're going to want to mix all those things up, and then we're going to broadcast that over our entire garden. And we're going to do this kind of once a year. It's really best to do this in the fall so that it has the winter to kind of break down, but the spring is okay too. It's really just a matter of doing it once a year, not doing it too often, because these things are going to take time to break down. You're going to put these in the soil, and the microbes, as long as they're nice and active like we've been talking about, are going to start consuming these things and breaking these things down and making them available to the plant roots. So really it's a matter of procuring your materials, sticking to your recipe, mixing it up, and broadcasting on the garden. So let's go see what that looks like. Now that we have our recipe and we have our materials, we're going to weigh them out, we're going to create our mix, and we're going to put them out for the beginning of the season. So once we have the prescription for the different materials that are going to balance our soil, it's time to mix all those together and apply them to our beds. Before we do that, I want to have a quick note about using Kinsey Agricultural Services. I've dealt with them for years. They really know what they're doing. Really what they are is a consulting service that has a relationship with a lab. So a soil lab is going to give them the numbers that they get, and then they are going to interpret them and send us a recommendation. Now, not all labs are like that. Sometimes if you send a soil sample into a different lab, they'll just give you the numbers, what they found, but they won't give you recommendations. So just be careful again to find a lab that will give you recommendations, or find a consulting service that will. If you choose to use a state lab, it can be free or very cheap, but they're not going to give you the kinds of information that a private lab will. So just something to keep in mind. And if you're going to send a soil sample in, I want it to be as usable as possible. With that being said, we've been given all of our recommendations from Kinsey Ag, and what they have given us is they've given us a certain recommendation of each type of material per 1,000 square feet. Now our beds are only 200 square feet each. So we have 6 of them, so that's 1,200 square feet total, but there's also pathways mixed in. So since I'm trying to save a little bit of money on the types of materials, how much materials that I need, so I'm only going to apply my minerals to my bed tops. That being said, each bed top, since it's 200 square feet, I'm going to divide what they recommend by 5, since 200 goes into 1,000 5 times. For instance, if they tell me to apply 15 pounds of dolomitic lime, I'm only going to apply 3 pounds to my 200 square foot area. You just have to divide what they've recommended by the square footage that you're going to apply it to. Pretty simple. Just wanted to highlight that. Now we're going to start at the top with what they've recommended. We're going to add it to my bucket. I've got it on top of this scale. It's tared out, so there's a 0 weight. Once we add each material, we're going to tare the scale. You can use a scale, a price computing market scale, or you can use a kitchen scale. You probably can't use a household scale to weigh yourself. It's not going to register these small numbers that we need. The first one is sulfur. They recommend 0.5 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Again, we only have 200 square feet, so 0.5 divided by 5 is going to be 0.1. It's a very small amount. So we're going to add a little bit of sulfur till we get 0.1. Going to go 3 pounds of dolomite. Bought this at Lowe's. It's 6.75 pounds. I had a half bag left. So it's a little bit over 3 pounds. With something like this, we don't have to necessarily remove some of our lime. It's inevitably going to fall into the pathways. You just want to have, in general, 3 pounds. You don't want 6 pounds of lime or 1 pound of lime. You want to get it around that 3 pound area. And that applies to all of our minerals. K-Mag, our requirement would be 5.75 pounds. I'm going to tare this so I can get my correct measurement. That is 1.5, 3.2. Almost there. Okay. We have some OO50, which is some potassium. We'll tear this out. 0.85 pounds of that. Manganese, 0.3 pounds. Copper, 0.4 pounds. And the last thing is our zinc. 0.1 pounds. All right, so some of these is not very much, but the point is you want to have a nice blend. So what we're going to do is we're going to take it and we're going to mix all this together just like we're making pancakes. We're going to take this, mix all of our ingredients till it's nice and homogenized. Get the clumps out if there's any clumps. And now we have a nice mix ready to distribute on our bed tops. Now this is the way that I like to do it. I like to make a big mix and put it on the beds. Another way to do it is to broadcast each individual material one at a time. I think that ends up taking a lot longer. I like cooking anyway, so this kind of reminds me of cooking. So I'm gonna put this on our beds, and then we're going to work it in. Now some people like to broadcast it like this. I'm more of a shaker kind of guy, but it's kind of up to you. However you want to get it on there, so it's nice and even. And one thing that I'll note about this is if you want to be precise about it and you're really nervous about putting all of your amendments down in one pass with one bucket on a long bed, or if you've got a 50-foot bed, however you want to slice it, one thing you can do is take the whole contents of this, split it into 2 buckets, split your bed into half, and then you have half of your amount that would go on the full bed. You have half of that to go on one side of your bed and half of that to go on the other side of your bed. You can even break that up into 4 if you think that would be helpful. Either way, the important part is to evenly get all of your material onto your bed, and then we have to work it in. So to do that, it's pretty simple. We're not going to use a really complicated tool. This is a manure fork, and all we're going to do is kind of take some of the layers and sift it like this. We'll go all the way down. Really, we're just letting those minerals kind of fall down through the fork to kind of incorporate. If your soil's not so loose like that, you can also just rake it in. Not a problem, because eventually what's going to happen is the rainwater is going to get on your bed. It's going to bring all those minerals down. The important part is you want to get them evenly distributed on your bed and worked in just a little bit. It's really not too complicated. You just have to, once you have your recipe, you mix up a nice dry ingredient pancake batter, you put it on your beds, you make sure it's even, you incorporate it just a little bit. It should make for a much more productive season for you. And as long as you can have your minerals in balance, you'll have a lot of great results. In our next lessons, we're going to be talking about fertility sources in this, for feeding your soil and your plants. It should be a really great lesson. So let's get to it, and I'll see you there.